On your Wednesday episode of Locked On Raptors, some news, some notes, and a damn good Team Canada men's Olympic roster.
You are Locked On Raptors, your daily Toronto Raptors podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey, what's going on? And welcome to another episode of Locked On Raptors, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. It is Wednesday, July the 10th, and I'm your host, Sean Woodley. I've been covering the Toronto Raptors now for 10 seasons on various platforms. You can find all my work over on the Hell website at Woodley Sean. You can find the show on Instagram at Locked On Raptors. And of course, you can join us in the Locked On Raptors Discord server. It is sicko season indeed in there, talking about the upcoming 2025 NBA draft, talking about Summer League. If you're a sicko who wants to talk about basketball with other sickos, the Locked On Raptors Discord is a little sicko pen full of sickos to do said discussion with. Please come join us in our little listener family. Link in the description of the podcast. Free to join as always. Of course, you can find the show for free wherever you get your podcast. Follow, subscribe, rate, review, tell a friend. Always appreciated when you support the show, however it is you choose to support the show on the audio side of things. You can also go and support us on YouTube. Just find the Locked On Raptors YouTube channel, subscribe, and then hit the little notification bell. You get a heads up via push notification every single time the show goes live or premieres, which is a wonderful thing. Also, a wonderful thing is our sponsor for today, which is our pals at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDINNBA for $20 off your first ticket purchase. Terms apply. All right, on today's show, got a little bit of everything to dig into today. We've got some news updates regarding Gary Trent Jr., maybe not news necessarily, but sort of clarifying details from Michael Grange. Ulrich Chomche signs a two-way deal with the Raptors. That's a bit surprising. We'll get into that. The Team Canada Olympic roster on the men's side has been announced. We will dig into that. Very, very talented. Lots of expectation, as there should be. And then we have a mailbag question or two to round the show out. We'll get to a whole bunch of stuff today. Let's start, however, with the Gary Trent Jr. of it all. Yesterday, Michael Grange had some reporting on Twitter regarding the situation around Gary Trent Jr. and the sort of internal valuation from the Raptors side of things. And it seems as though there was a bit of an impasse with the contract talks before the contract talks ever even actually happened. Reporting, sort of clarifying things today from Michael Grange suggests that there never actually was a formal offer on the table from the Raptors, but internally, the suggestion from Grange is that about $15 million was the limit of what the Raptors are willing to pay Gary Trent Jr. The reporting also is that his representation was looking for $25 million as a starting salary, an increase on the $18.5 million he was making over the past 3 seasons with the Raptors. Understandable to want to raise for a guy who's now 25 and is theoretically in his prime, but pretty hard to not look at this Gary Trent Jr. situation and think Gary Trent Jr. is like an Exhibit A victim of the new CBA and the restrictions around spending that are just being imposed on the entire league by the owners themselves. Of course, they made the bed they now lie in. And Gary Trent Jr. is one of these role player type guys who in a previous world where the second apron wasn't a concern and there wasn't these really strict limitations on teams and the luxury tax, might be the kind of guy that a very good team goes out and says, hey, let's spend a little extra cake, go get ourselves a Gary Trent Jr. to help us with our shooting and give us an extra jolt, going into a season where we're hoping to contend. And that's just not the market that Gary Trent Jr. found for himself this summer. And that sucks for him, right? It sucks to see guys not get paid what they perceive their value to be, what they've been used to earning in the NBA. But the sort of reality of the new CBA is that the upper class is going to take up a lot of the sort of big, chunky salary cap parts for these teams, and role players are going to be kind of left to fight for the scraps. And that seems to be where Gary Trent Jr. has found himself. And look, I think $15 million from the Raptors side of things would have been a pretty generous offer to Gary Trent Jr., considering the sort of landscape of the league. And of course, we saw them draft Jacoby Walter. They have Grady Dick in house. It seemed as though the draft pick of Walter signaled that, hey, we're not super willing to, negotiate too much from this number. We're pretty far apart. We're just going to move on and we'll sort of, part our ways and say goodbye and say thanks for your service, Gary Trent Jr. I think ultimately that's probably the right call, even if there will be, I think, a Gary Trent Jr. sized hole in the Raptors core lineups this coming season that they'll need someone to step into and evolve into, right? It's not that Gary Trent Jr. is this really difficult to replace player. He's very one dimensional. He, does a lot of things on offense reasonably well. The 3-point shooting, the mid-range stuff, maybe that is the end of the line of the stuff he does really well. But, he was a useful piece and a guy who fit nicely with Scottie Barnes and played well off of him historically going back many years. Ever since Scottie Barnes joined the Raptors, those two have had really nice offensive production when playing together. It's not that Gary Trent Jr., didn't do anything. There are going to be things that need to be replaced here. But that said, I do think in the next season or two, there's a very real chance that Grady Dick and or Jacoby Walter end up stepping into that role as that sort of fifth option, play finishing, 3-point shooting type guy who brings spacing and will ultimately be possible upgrades on that position over Gary Trent Jr. Obviously, a lot to be worked out with Grady Dick's defense and Jacoby Walter's, the sort of drop off he had shooting wise in college, despite the clear shooting talent he has. Can he replicate, the sort of expected 3-point percentage that people were looking for from him and not be in that 34% range he was in college? Like, that's a real open question. The defense for Jacoby Walter is a big question. All these things have to come along, but I do think the easiest type of player to replace in the modern NBA is a one-dimensional 3-point shooter. And I do think that Grady Dick and Jacoby Walter bring something that I don't think Gary Trent Jr. really ever had in his tool bag, which is movement shooting, which is, weaponizing, flying around screens, using them in off-ball actions to divert the attention of defenses, draw, extra defensive attention to open up avenues elsewhere on the floor. Gary Trent Jr. was never really that type of shooter. He was very stationary. Sure, he could go and make something happen when the ball came to him late in the clock. That was a nice thing that he brought to the table. But for the most part, his 3-point shots came as the result of, pretty stationary 3-point shooting or sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 dribble pull-ups. I think that's a pretty easy sort of collection of threes to replace. And I do think what Grady Dick and Jacoby Walter figure to do, if everything hits for them, is going to be a better long-term fit for what the Raptors want to do than Gary Trent Jr. making $15 million a year, especially when you consider that, there are guys in this free agent market who are like two-way wings, guys who have played high-leverage playoff minutes, Derrick Jones Jr., Caleb Martin, these types of guys barely scraping to make $10 million a year. 15 mil for what Gary brings to the table would, I think, have been a little bit too much. And so I'm glad the Raptors didn't make the sort of mistake of worrying about losing him for nothing, right? Yes, you quote unquote lose a guy for nothing, but Gary Trent Jr. gave you 3.5 seasons of pretty solid production. He was there to help facilitate the development of Scottie Barnes. You didn't get nothing for Gary Trent Jr. Maybe in the grand scheme, if you take back the transaction tree and, so you sort of look at the Norm Powell situation, you look and say, hey, like maybe they should have just kept Norman Powell. I think the upside play of trading for a guy who at the time was 21, 22 years old, who was 6 years younger than Norman Powell, both going into contract summers, to get new deals. I think it was a perfectly fine upside play. And I'm not sitting here ruining the trade of Norman Powell. I think ultimately guys move on. This is the turn of the NBA. This is what happens with NBA bench guys. They walk and they go elsewhere and you often don't get anything back. It kind of reminds me of like the Patrick Patterson loss from last decade, where it felt like it was the end of the world to lose Patrick Patterson. But in the grand scheme of things, he was a nice 7th or 8th man. And, those guys walk for nothing all the time and nobody is worse for wear. And so it's kind of my read on the Gary Trent Jr. thing. I think ultimately it might have a 1 or 2 year sort of decreasing effect of the potency of the sort of best core lineups for the Raptors. But I think the skill sets of Grady Dick and Jacoby Walter should eventually fill in that slot pretty nicely. And we'll get into a little bit more into Grady Dick and his potential to start for the Raptors coming up in the final segment when we have a mailbag question to get to. Very quickly, before we get to the break, wanted to hit on Ulrich Chomche as well. The other bit of news from the Raptors out of the last day or so, signs a 2-way deal with the Raptors. Maybe a bit of a surprise. I think there was maybe the suggestion they might stash him, keep him over in the BAL in Africa, or maybe put him on a team in Europe, whatever it might have been. Still pretty raw, pretty far away from making a serious impact in the NBA as the youngest player from this past draft, and by all accounts, the rawest player as well. But I do think that this is the luxury now of having that third two-way spot that came in, what was it, last season, the year before. If this is still a world where you have two-way slots, he probably doesn't get this kind of opportunity to come over and effectively be what I expect will be kind of like a stash, but a stash in Mississauga and not somewhere overseas. I think that's a nice thing the Raptors are going to get a chance here to do with Ulrich Chomche. I don't think we should be seeing Ulrich Chomche playing any NBA minutes outside of the odd garbage time appearance this coming season. Maybe no NBA minutes for 2 seasons, frankly. He's got a lot of work to do to just sort of grow into his body and, become an adult on a basketball floor. The G League can very much help with that. And because they have those 3 two-ways to play with, I think it gives them the leeway to sort of reserve one of those two-way spots just to have Ulrich Chomche be a developmental piece for them for years to come. And maybe he hits and becomes something, and maybe he doesn't. And that's just what happens with the second to last pick in the second round. But I do think the 3 two-way contract slots opens up this possibility. And I think it's pretty interesting. We're going to get to see him in Summer League, which is very exciting. Wasn't sure we'd see that. And so, I think it's going to be cool to kind of see where he's at, gauge his level of, progression and where he's got to get to from where he is right now. That's going to be a big storyline of Summer League, I think. But an interesting note, I think, again, if we see him doing anything but playing in the G League next season, maybe that's the signal that something horrible has gone wrong, or that the Raptors are trying the most brazen tank job of all time by rolling him out there for heavy minutes. But I am glad we'll get to see his development up close and in person in Mississauga with Raptors 905. And he gets to be around the NBA team as well, which certainly has to have some impact and positive sort of long-term effect in some way that's pretty unquantifiable going forward as well. So, yeah. Those are the news and notes. Gary Trent Jr., Ulrich Chomche. We're going to come back on the other side, talk about another bit of news from today, which is Team Canada's men's Olympic roster fully announced. We're going to get into the roster, some quick takeaways on the 12-man group they've put together, remind you all of the sort of landscape of the tournament and the gauntlet they have to go through in Group A in the Olympic field. We'll get into all that coming up. Mailbag questions coming up later on in the show. But, Team Canada stuff coming up in just one sec. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at Game Time, the single best place to buy tickets for your favorite sporting events. And it is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on Game Time on the app go down closer to the first pitch, which is pretty sweet. Maybe you want to go check out a Blue Jays game. They're not very good, but you can go and get yourself some cheap tickets because they're not very good. Or maybe you're like me and my wife. We like to travel around in the summertime, go see some baseball games at various parks down in the States. If you want to go do that, it's a wonderful way to get very cheap tickets. A lot of baseball teams not selling a ton of tickets out there, and you can go get yourself some sweet, great tickets with last-minute deals, views from your seat so you know exactly what you're getting into if you're going to a stadium you've never been to before, and, of course, all-in pricing, so there's no surprise fees at checkout. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Back at it here on your Wednesday edition of Locked On Raptors, running through a whole bunch of news and listener questions and a little grab bag of stuff for you here on an off-season Wednesday in July. Summer League coming up soon, of course. We'll have all sorts of coverage of that going into next week, but we're in a bit of a soft fallow period here where it seems like the Raptors are done moving anything and they have yet to play any Summer League games as of yet. So we'll run through the news. The Team Canada Olympic men's roster announced today. Not a ton of surprises, but we'll run through the roster for you. The 12-man group going to Paris to compete for an Olympic medal. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Toronto Raptor. RJ Barrett, former Toronto Raptor. Kem Birch, Dylan Brooks, Lou Dort. Melvin Ejim is the one non-NBA guy who makes the team, a long-time mainstay of the national program. Very cool to see Ejim, who has been through all kinds of ups and downs with this program, get himself an invite to Paris. Very, very cool indeed. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander will be the best player on this team and one of the best players in the tournament. Pretty awesome. Trey Lyles from the Sacramento Kings. We'll get into him a little bit. Pretty important player on this team, I think. Jamal Murray, Andrew Nembhard, Kelly Olynyk from your Toronto Raptors, and Dwight Powell. That's your group going to Paris for what is probably going to be the single best on best international basketball men's tournament we've ever seen. It's going to be absolutely stacked, and Canada's group is very much going to fall under that distinction. It's Canada, it's Australia at number 5 in the world, Greece with Giannis Antetokounmpo. So yeah, terrifying. And then Spain, number 2 in the world. Maybe don't have the high-end superstar talent anymore to really scare you, but former Raptor Lorenzo Brown absolutely killing it for the Spanish national team, and they always just are there because they play an incredibly FIBA-friendly style of ball. Tough group for Team Canada. A reminder of the other groups. Group B, you've got France with Victor Wembanyama and Rudy Gobert, like running pick and rolls and stuff together in a truly horrifying future basketball situation. You've got Brazil, Bruno Caboclo, lots of, Raptors ties there, of course, Japan, and then Germany. And then Group C, you've got the States, Puerto Rico, South Sudan, and Serbia. Loaded field, man. And look, this is a tough field to be going to work and looking for your first medal and looking to make good on, frankly, more than a decade of lead up of expectation for this team. They were supposed to be there in Tokyo in 2020/21. That was really supposed to be it. They failed in that qualifying tournament. I think it was against the Czech Republic, if I'm not mistaken. Thomas Satoransky ruining their hopes in Victoria, BC. Yeah, like this is it. Like this is what this has been building to, and it's going to be a real letdown if Canada can't make it out of the group, if they can't advance to the point where they have a shot at a medal. Yes, there is a lot of talent in this tournament, but you could argue no team is deeper than Team US than Canada outside of Team USA. And top end talent wise, it's right there. Jamal Murray was just the second best player on the NBA champions a year ago. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is a perennial at this point, top 3 to 5 MVP candidate. He's unbelievable. RJ Barrett is a very good player. And on down the line, Dylan Brooks absolutely killed it for Canada last year when they won bronze at the FIBA World Cup. This team is stacked, even with the absences of Andrew Wiggins and, Zach Edey, among others. This team is loaded and should be going in with very high expectations. The expectation should be to at least be in the conversation for medals. And if they're not, I think it's fair to call it a disappointment, to say that there was failure in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, we got to see how it happens. If they lose 3 narrow, close games with Australia, Greece, and Spain, maybe that colors it differently than if they were to get blown out in those games or whatever. We have to see the actual context of what happens in the tournament before we declare anything a failure or a success. But I think there really should be super high expectations going into this tournament, and there should be belief. They're very good. They just won the bronze in the FIBA World Cup a year ago. There is a lot of reason to believe that this team can, weather the group stage, even though it's a difficult group. I think top end talent wise, outside of Greece, Canada is right at the top. And I think, I think inarguably Canada's deeper in top end talent beyond the best player on each respective team. So they should have a shot at winning every single one of their group games, even though it's a gauntlet. And then beyond that, obviously, it happens to, what does the bracket do? Where do they end up in the knockouts? Do they play the States early? Does that send them home early? Like all this will inform our feelings and our sort of takeaways on what this tournament was for Canada when it's all said and done. But I do think there should be some pretty serious expectation going in for some real success. And unquestionably, this should be the best result they ever get in an Olympic tournament to this point. And look, it's not going to be easy. And I think a big reason is that the big man spot, for me, if you're looking at this Team Canada roster, it's the bigs who are the real question. I think there's like a lot of interesting stuff they're going to be able to do with multi-guard lineups, multi-wing lineups, and things like that. I would pencil in the starting 5 probably to be Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Jamal Murray, RJ Barrett, Dylan Brooks, Kelly Olynyk. It's maybe maybe you swap in Olynyk for a more defensively oriented center like Dwight Powell or Trey Lyles, maybe even Kem Birch. But I think most likely that's your best 5. I think you roll with that. I think that's a really good offensive 5. And there's enough wing defense there with Dylan Brooks to throw on the best, opposing star for the other team. He's going to guard Giannis. Like that's going to be a thing. Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, a fantastic point of attack defender as well. And then you can sprinkle in your Andrew Nembhard, also a great defender. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, a total stud on that end. Lou Dort. Like they have lots of different guys and combinations they can throw in on the wings for defense. And that's going to be essential because the rim protection, the interior defense, just the general interior size is going to be, I think, the sort of Achilles heel of this team. And they'll have to overcome it with their excellent guard play. They'll have to overcome it with really dogged, point of attack defense from guys who are all capable of doing that exact thing. Doesn't have to be a death knell for this team's medal hopes that they don't really have a traditional rim protector. It would be so nice if Zach Edey were on this team, just to plant him in the paint with those FIBA rules, with no three in the key, have a 7'4" dude hanging around the rim, catching lobs, getting putbacks, things like that. They don't have it though, and they're going to have to overcome that big time. I think Kelly Olynyk's going to be huge, but his defense, we saw with the Raptors last year, that's not the strength of him. He's a very good FIBA player, and it's a different ball game, of course, with the no three in the key rule. But I do think Kelly Olynyk's going to be tough to be the sort of backline of defense for this team. And I think Trey Lyles might sneakily be the most important player in the front court for this team, right? Like I think Trey Lyles, he's got the size at 6'10". He's got some shooting and sort of offensive skill and pop. I think there's a world in which he ends up being their closing big man in a lot of these games. If, it's not working defensively with Olynyk, they're going to be in tough, right? If they come across a Serbia, I'm not sure what they do with Nikola Jokic. If they come across France, good luck with Wemby and Gobert. Like, it's going to be a challenge no matter what. I do think, though, in their group with Australia, Greece, Spain, they can probably weather the big man sort of concerns and lack of super high-end talent in that position just to get out of the group. Beyond that, it gets a little trickier and very much dependent on matchups, as any, single elimination tournament is always going to be. But yeah, those are the kind of things I'm keeping an eye on. I think they're going to score just fine. I think the guard play is going to be exemplary, arguably the best guard play of any team in the tournament, with Shea and Murray and Nembhard coming in off the bench. Like, that is a lot of really talented guards to go and create for you. I think Dylan Brooks, we've seen it. He ratchets it up for FIBA as well. I'm pretty bullish. We'll talk a lot more about this and the women's tournaments as we get closer to the Olympics as well. It's going to be a big part of the show once we get into August and things like that. But yeah, that's just sort of the first 10,000 foot view of Team Canada and their 12-man roster. It'd be cool if they had more bigs. If you are a young Canadian basketball player, be tall and you might have yourself a future with the Canadian national team. Damn shame there's no Zach Edey, man. That'd be a very nice thing to have, just for, matchups in particular that you need some size for. It's going to be tough to overcome not having the 7'4" dude. But again, very, very talented roster, the most talented roster they've ever sent to an Olympics. And I cannot wait to watch it. We'll cover lots on the podcast, as we always do with Canada basketball in the summer. The one advantage I have over most of the other podcasts on the Locked On Network is I can basically just cover Team Canada and be like, yeah, it's basically Raptors adjacent. It's a beautiful thing. We're going to come back on the other side, and we are going to get into a couple of mailbag questions that came in regarding starters and fitting around Immanuel, Quickley, and Scottie Barnes, picking up the thread of yesterday's episode where we talked with Lewis about Scottie and Quickley and the bet the Raptors are making on those guys being the pillars of a contender going forward. We will get to that coming up in just 1 second. All right, rounding up the show here on your Wednesday. Thanks so much for hanging out. Just a heads up, tomorrow on the show, Jamar Hines will be here. We're going to play a little game called Who's Going to Play More? Just some either or heads up questions between two guys on the Raptors vying for similar positions. We're going to get into that, and I'm very much looking forward to that. We're going to have Vivek Jacob on Friday for his usual weekly chat. Also, programming note regarding the over-under spectacular. We are going to take that up. Probably a late July thing. Scheduling. Sahal's been on vacation. Vivek was on the road with the cricket national team. We are going to get it all sorted out, but it might be a later July, August thing for the over-unders. But we will still be handing out a winner for the over-unders contest for the year from all those who submitted submissions. And we'll also figure out who won between the three of us as I look for my first ever title in our annual Locked On Raptors over-unders spectacular. Just a little later than usual getting to it, but we will get to it. I promise, for those who are anxiously waiting to figure out if they have actually won the contest and are taking the crown from our pal Jay Rich, who won last year. All right, let's get to it. A couple mailbag questions. This one here comes from Vicon in the Discord asking, after Scottie, IQ, RJ, and Yak, who is the most likely to be the fifth starter for each of these three windows of the season? 1, before Christmas; 2, after Christmas, before the trade deadline; and 3, after the trade deadline. This is a good question. I think that fifth starting spot is one of the more interesting things coming into camp. I think there will be a pretty earnest battle for that job between a lot of guys. And I think I would put, my money on a couple of guys more than others. But I do think there's a lot of ways the Raptors could go with this. I think the sort of common first two answers you think of are, okay, well, Bruce Brown's going to be on the team. He probably starts in that 2 spot. If he is better than he was down the stretch of last season, which I think is likely if he's playing with better players and is not dealing with the knee thing that hampered him down the stretch, and the team is playing competent normal basketball, I think there's a real chance Bruce Brown finds a niche within the team. I do not think it's going to be as a starter over the course of the season, though. I think to answer this question, we could see Bruce Brown be the starter out of the gate and maybe lose the job eventually when the sort of spacing concerns pop up and maybe the lineup is sort of begging for a little bit more shooting juice. That's where Grady Dick comes in. I don't think Grady Dick is going to start from the very beginning of this season. I think there's a couple other candidates that I think I'd maybe pencil in as more likely than him. And I don't think they want to rush Grady Dick. I don't think they should want to rush Grady Dick. It's very easy to get excited about the back half of his season last year, which I don't think was fake. I know it happened during the fake part of the season, but I think his February is kind of the month you circle. Before the season got fake, when the team was actually playing at its best and he was playing with good players, he was playing quite well. He had easily his best month of the year and kind of showed that, play finishing, 3-point shooting, off ball, off screen shooting, secondary, connective passing, things like that. I think that's all there for Grady Dick. And if you're, thinking about the geometry of your lineups, Grady Dick is going to make a lot of the Raptors lineups just that much more suited to modern basketball, suited to playing Darko Rajakovic's system, where the space he's going to provide for others to create advantages and then capitalize on those advantages. That is like the Grady Dick promise of, whatever he's going to be once he reaches his peak 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line from now. But he can get started on that this year. It would be a lot. They'll probably lose minutes with Grady Dick in there just because you lose minutes with young players on the floor all the time. But, if you think about what the starters were last year with Gary Trent Jr., again, very limited sample. I think they played only 10 games together. They were still the number 2 most used lineup for the Raptors last season. So that's maybe worth noting a little bit. Just about a plus 12 net rating per 100 possessions. That is very, very good. And even if there's some drop off when Grady Dick is in there, can that lineup be a positive? I think it can be. It requires RJ Barrett to step up on defense a little bit and figure out what he could not figure out last year. It requires Scottie Barnes and Jakob Poeltl to be airtight as the last line of defense at the rim. But I do think the offense for that group could be pretty potent. And because Grady Dick, as I mentioned off the top of the show, is a bit more of a dynamic shooter than Gary Trent Jr. was, I think he'll fit into the offense even more seamlessly than Gary could. And I think it could be a pretty damn potent offensive lineup with some defensive issues, sure, but one that I think can kind of tread water at the very least and be a decent core base lineup that's not hemorrhaging minutes to open games every single night. And maybe that is something they get to more close to the middle of the season. So yeah, he'll be my answer for that second stretch. And I'll just say he sticks with the team and is the starter throughout the entire season after he ends up taking the job around Christmas, I suppose, if I'm going with the confines of this question. The other guy, I guess there's 2 other guys who could, in theory, find their way into the starting lineup. I think Davion Mitchell is kind of a stealth candidate. I don't think I want to see that, but as a point of attack defender next to Immanuel Quickley to kind of alleviate that burden a little bit, I could see the argument for him. It will absolutely require that he hits threes at or better, at the same rate or better that he did last year, where he was about 36% on, middling volume. If he can be a 37, 38% guy on, 3, 4, 5 attempts a game, then I think Davion Mitchell's a starting caliber player. I'm just not super sold on the shooting, and the size is still a concern. If you're rolling out a backcourt that is Immanuel Quickley at 6'3" and Davion Mitchell at 6 foot, all the wingspan in the world is not going to make those guys not 6'3" and 6 foot in the grand scheme of things. And so that's my hang up with the Mitchell idea as a starter. The other one too, and then I don't know if a lot of people have talked about, but like Kelly Olynyk could start. Kelly Olynyk could start next to Jakob Poeltl. They could go big. Scottie Barnes could be your nominal 3, Barrett at the 2, and Quickley as the 1. That's a pretty big, beefy lineup. There's some insulation for Olynyk with Poeltl at the rim. it makes your second units pretty hard to sort of put together. Obviously, there's going to be some serious staggering of Quickley and Barnes, one would assume. I wouldn't mind seeing like second units anchored by Quickley and Jakob Poeltl pick and roll, and you kind of fill in the gaps around them. But, Olynyk is one of the better shooters on the team. He's a very good passer. He would fit nicely into what they want to do on offense. You could run him or Jakob Poeltl from the elbows, kind of get creative with the way you leverage Poeltl's rim pressure and Olynyk's three-point shooting, and both of their passing in concert with one another. That seems like something that could fit a Darko style. And maybe if you get some steps from Scottie Barnes and RJ Barrett defensively, that makes that viable. I actually think there's, I'd probably say Bruce Brown's like 55% the starter from day one, but I do think there's like a 40% chance that Kelly Olynyk slides in there as well. Maybe not the perfect lineup by any means, but they would be big, which is a useful thing in the NBA. If you're rolling 6'6", 6'9", 7 foot across your 2, 3, 4, 5, that at least gives you like functional size to maybe overcompensate for the lack of great individual defense. You have at least some length out there to be imposing and all that good stuff. So that I think is kind of my read on the starting situation. I am intrigued by, maybe someone else is like a stealth candidate who appears out of nowhere. I'm not super sure who that would be, frankly, but maybe they throw Jonathan Mobo out there as the starting 3 and everyone's very, very happy. And by everyone, I mean me exactly, and only me. But yeah, I think it's pretty likely that Bruce is going to be the day one starter, and it very much could evolve from there with Grady, Kelly, Davion Mitchell all figuring into the mix there. Last question here from Calvin, asking, with IQ and Scottie locked in as our future, which players or types of players at the 2, 3, and 5 would be the perfect fits to make us a contender again? I love this question because I think my favorite thing about thinking about basketball, about analyzing basketball, is imagining fit, imagining complementary skills working off of one another. And we'll just go pie in the sky. We're not going to go individual player names right now, but we'll go with the sort of archetype I think the Raptors would really be looking for here. I think with Scottie Barnes on the team, there's a reason to want to prioritize scoring from other positions, right? Like we're going to see Quickley average a bunch, I would think. I don't think Scottie's ever going to be your classic 28, 29 point a game best player on a great team type guy. I think he can be the best player on a very good team, but I don't think it's going to be in the same shape as, say, Giannis, where he's averaging 30 a game, or an Embiid or anything like that. He has a little bit more of a well-rounded game. He's a jack of all trades. And, I think he does a lot on defense to kind of cut into maybe the energy he's got to work with on offense, things like that. I think surrounding Scottie Barnes and his visionary passing with all kinds of scoring juice is a pretty interesting way to go about building this team. I think, as is the case with most modern NBA teams, if you can get yourself a spacing and rim protecting big man to play the 5, that's the dream fit next to Scottie Barnes. Your Serge Ibaka from 2018 type of thing. What a wonderful fit that would be. It's hard to find those guys, right? Marc Gasol would be an outstanding fit. Marc Gasol is a one-of-one type of big man from the last 25 years of basketball. And so it's really hard to find those guys. But for going pie in the sky, ideal archetypes, then your spacing, rim protecting big, I basically think is the best kind of center for any team in the modern NBA. There just happen to be like 7 guys who fit that description at any given time, and getting one of them on your team is very difficult. The 2 and the 3, like I think honestly, like RJ Barrett can be a beautiful fit at the 2 for this Raptors team, especially if you have a spacing big at the 5. I don't know if I trust RJ Barrett to be a 40% 3-point shooter all the time again, but I think the way he provides rim pressure, the way he gets downhill, the way he leverages screens from his big man to get to the rim, the way he finished last year, like if RJ Barrett can be the player he was last season, he is a perfectly fine starting 2 for this team. I think they can legitimately say Quickley, Barrett, Barnes is the trio to build around, and then you sort of fit the pieces in from there. And, maybe he doesn't replicate that. It's a very hard thing to do. He was fantastic last season, wildly efficient in a way he's never been, but the team context, the different change of scenery, playing at home all seem to inform the change in his game. And I think there's a real chance it sticks. And so if you can get that RJ, I think at the 2, he's a perfectly fine guy to have long-term. And then you're looking at, look, every team is best off with a 3 who is a 2-way large wing who can handle the best defensive assignments and give you a little bit of juice offensively. The sort of dream outcome, like A player like Tracy McGrady, what a perfect fit. Score first, can defend his ass off, is huge. Like a Tracy McGrady type, shocking, hot take, would be a really good fit on this type of team next to a Scottie Barnes, someone who could be maybe the number one scoring option in your team, and you feel pretty good about it. If you're looking at the draft for next year, if that's your thing, a guy like Ace Bailey comes to mind, right? 6'10", super electric scoring wing. The defense is maybe more of a question, but he's 6'10", and maybe that becomes your guy to slot in there long term if you get the insane lottery luck of getting to draft Ace Bailey. Obviously you probably got to scale it back a little bit in terms of expectation because there's only so many of those superstar wings out there. I mentioned an OG Anunoby type throughout the lead up to free agency. What a perfect fit he would be. He would be an awesome fit. I think that could bring them to something close to contention with the right pieces at the 5 and whatnot. And the proper development, of course, from Quickley and Barnes. I think a guy like Trey Murphy, a 6'10" wing who can bomb threes and defend for you, would be a really nice piece to fit in there as well. That's the dream archetype. It also happens to be maybe the hardest type of player to find. So it's going to be a slog until they can get that. There might be a few Joey Grahams before they find themselves their Kawhi Leonard 2.0. And that's maybe upsetting to think about, but it's a tough position to fill. And as I said, during all of the lead up to OG Anunoby getting traded, OG Anunoby is the type of guy who you trade and then instantly spend the next 20 years looking for. That might be the case. And, if they don't find that type of wing guy, then yeah, the ceiling of this roster is probably capped. Unless, of course, Scottie Barnes can himself become that type of wing guy. I just think Scottie has proven he's probably more of a playmaking 4 type of dude who with some, positional versatility to play all over, but a 4 on defense and a sort of do everything creative type on offense. That's kind of the read there. So yeah, I don't know if I answered the question well, but that is the sort of read for me on the ideal archetypes to fit around Scottie Barnes. And if you can find sort of a guy who can sort of light it up from the 3 and an offensive structure where Scottie doesn't have to be the clear number 1 offensive option all the time, at least scoring wise, he can use his passing and the attention he draws, the double teams he draws to create for others. That feels like basketball utopia for Scottie Barnes and the Immanuel Quickley Scottie Raptors. We'll leave it there. We'll come back tomorrow with Jamar Hines to play a little Who's Going to Play More, another one of our wonderfully named and crafted game show segments here on the podcast. And we got lots more, of course, this week. Next week, we're going to talk. Next week, we're going to have an episode with Parker Ainsworth from Locked On Cougs talking about Jamal Shed. Recorded that one earlier this week. It's great. It's super fun, very informative on Jamal Shed and what to expect from him. We'll have Summer League stuff as Summer League gets kicked off on Friday with the Raptors' first game as well. So all sorts of stuff for you on tap in the days to come. Thank you so much for hanging. Thank you for supporting the show. Thanks for following, subscribing, rating, reviewing, etc., etc. Always appreciated when you support the show. However it is you support the show. And we'll talk to you again on Thursday for another episode of Locked On Raptors. Thanks for hanging. Bye-bye.